Half of all middle-class Latino families and nearly 4 in 10 Black middle-class families have been mathematically eradicated from purchasing a home in their local markets. You are living through the Great Housing Reset of 2026, a permanent structural purge where the traditional trajectory of middle-class wealth accumulation has been violently dismantled. Since 2019, median home prices have surged by a staggering 50%, while your median household income crawled up by a pathetic 29%. The gap between what you earn and what you must pay to own a piece of this country is no longer a cyclical anomaly. It is a mathematical chasm that minor, fractional drops in interest rates cannot even begin to close. You are being told by mainstream analysts that the housing market is stabilizing. They are feeding you a dangerous illusion. The Federal Reserve slashed its benchmark rate by a full percentage point in 2024 and drove it down another 75 basis points in late 2025. Consequently, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate dropped from its terrifying 8% peak and settled into a baseline range of 5.90 to 6.30% in early 2026. This is not salvation. This rate is still more than double the pandemic-era lows, fundamentally castrating your purchasing power. Market forecasts from J.P. Morgan project flat 0% price growth nationally. Redfin anticipates a marginal 1% increase, while Morgan Stanley predicts 2% appreciation in 2026. A stalling housing market does not mean an affordable housing market. When prices freeze at historic, catastrophic highs and borrowing costs remain elevated, you are trapped. Affordability only returns if your wages compound faster than housing costs for half a decade. Do you expect your boss to double your salary over the next 5 years? The underlying reality is about to get much worse because international energy markets are actively weaponized against your mortgage rate. Ongoing geopolitical conflicts involving Iran are introducing extreme volatility into global oil prices. Escalating oil prices trigger massive inflationary panic, which directly drives up bond yields. Because the 10-year Treasury yield is the absolute benchmark for your mortgage rate, a drone strike in the Middle East actively prevents domestic lending rates from falling to a level where you can afford a starter home. The threat does not stop at foreign borders. Domestic policymakers are actively floating the privatization of government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac through massive initial public offerings. Wall Street analysts estimate this move alone will instantly jack up mortgage rates by another 5 to 25 basis points, targeting lower income and first-time buyers for immediate elimination from the buyer pool. You are fighting a multi-front war against global supply chains, domestic policy, and the hyper-expansion of the artificial intelligence economy, which is currently creating hyper-localized real estate bubbles in tech-centric regions, entirely divorcing home prices from the reality of local median incomes. You might think you can just out-earn this crisis, but the statistical anatomy of middle-class disenfranchisement proves you cannot. Across the 160 largest metropolitan areas in the United States, 20% of all middle-class earners, the middle-class households sitting right in the middle 60% of the income distribution, cannot afford basic human necessities, including housing. This economic violence is not distributed equally. Historical income disparities have mutated this class-based issue into a severe crisis of racial wealth equity. The median income for white middle-class families sits at $81,000, yet 27% of them are entirely priced out of basic survival. Black middle-class families earn a median of $70,000, with 39% unable to afford necessities. Asian American families face a 41% exclusion rate. Native American families earn $75,000, yet 46% are locked out. Latino and Hispanic families earn $73,000, and exactly half of them are mathematically barred from sustaining a middle-class life. The very definition of the middle class has fractured across geographic fault lines. If you live in Youngstown, Ohio, earning $24,454 classifies you as middle class. If you pack up and move to Los Angeles, you need to generate between $36,561 and $186,459 just to secure that exact same societal standing. In the most brutal, cost-prohibitive markets on Earth, Salinas, Santa Barbara, San Francisco, and New York, less than 52% of all middle-class households can afford basic necessities. The sustainable urban middle class has been eradicated. You must look at the raw inventory data from the National Association of Realtors covering 2025 and 2026. National for-sale inventory rose by nearly 20% year over year. You probably thought this meant more options for you. It didn't. This growth was entirely captured by the financial elite. High-income buyers earning over $200,000 operate in a luxury playground with virtually unrestricted 100% access to available listings. Middle-income buyers, the teachers, the nurses, the skilled trades workers grinding out $75,000 a year, are facing the most violent housing shortage in modern history. The data exposes a massive national deficit of exactly 416,000 listings priced at or below $255,000. To reach a balanced, functional market, the United States must immediately manifest 2 affordable homes priced up to $255,000 for every single luxury property listed above $680,000. This is not happening. The lower middle class, earning $50,000, watched their market access shrink from an already pathetic 9.4% down to 8.7% over the past year. You are likely wondering why the supply is so constrained. You are up against the persistence and evolution of the mortgage lock-in effect, a psychological and financial prison that has paralyzed American mobility. During the emergency interventions of 2020 and 2021, the average mortgage rate collapsed to an all-time low of 2.96%. Millions of homeowners locked in 30-year fixed rates between 2.75% and 3.50%. Today, the market rate hovers around 6.2%. Let me show you the exact mathematical violence being committed against you. The traditional amortization formula, M equals P times R times 1 plus R to the power of N over 1 plus R to the power of N minus 1, proves that exchanging a pandemic-era mortgage for a current-rate mortgage on the exact same principal amount literally doubles the monthly payment. Nationally, the payment gap for a homeowner trying to move to a new property represents a terrifying 73.2% explosion in monthly housing costs. Discretionary sellers have been completely wiped off the board. Yet the third quarter of 2025 and early 2026 triggered a massive statistical inflection point. For the first time in half a decade, the share of homeowners carrying a mortgage rate over 6% finally surpassed the share of those holding ultra-low rates below 3%. Currently, 21.2% of mortgaged homeowners are trapped at rates of 6% and above. Another 10.2% hold rates between 5 and 5.99%. Meanwhile, 17.1% hold rates in the 4s, 31.5% are in the 3s, and exactly 20% hold the golden ticket below 3%. This distribution shift is critical. The absolute gridlock is beginning to thaw organically through forced life events, marriages, brutal divorces, corporate relocations, and deaths. But for the 21.2% of homeowners bleeding out at rates above 6%, any tiny drop in prevailing rates sparks an instant refinancing frenzy. United States mortgage refinancing volume is projected to explode by more than 30% annually in 2026, hitting $670 billion. The psychological devastation of this lock-in effect cannot be overstated. Surveys prove that 73% of mortgaged homeowners would pack up and move tomorrow if they could somehow transfer their current rate. 31% would list their homes immediately. The addiction to cheap debt is so profound that 1 in 4 homeowners with rates below 5% explicitly states that no amount of human currency would convince them to sell their property. Another 24% demand a massive $200,000 or more over market value just to surrender their rate. This mass psychosis has spawned a shadow inventory of 150,000 delisted homes nationally. These are equity-rich Americans who desperately want to move but yanked their listings off the market, choosing to wait out the Federal Reserve rather than swallow 6% debt. The societal collateral damage is sickening. 1/3 of Americans confess they are remaining in toxic living situations and dead-end relationships solely because they cannot afford the cost of a new lease or mortgage. 16% of the population has resorted to renting industrial self-storage units because they are physically trapped in homes they have completely outgrown. But the lock-in effect is only half the battle, because when you finally find a home to bid on, you are immediately crushed by the cartel of liquid capital. You are not competing against other families. You are competing against all cash dominance and institutional monopolization. In the first half of 2025, exactly 32.8% of all home purchases in the United States were executed entirely with raw cash. This sits drastically higher than the pre-pandemic norm of 28.6%. The distribution of this cash forms a violent U-shape, dominating the absolute bottom and the absolute top of the market, effectively crushing the middle class in a vice grip. At the low end, roughly 2/3 of all homes sold for under $100,000 were purchased in pure cash. This segment is swarmed by investors, aggressive flippers, and landlords hungry for high-yield rental properties. They strip the most affordable starter homes away from first-time middle-class buyers who desperately rely on FHA or conventional financing. At the high end, over 40% of homes over $1 million and more than 50% of homes over $2 million are acquired without a single drop of mortgage debt. This is the result of extreme wealth concentration and equity-rich coastal elites migrating inward, liquidating their overpriced California or New York properties and buying cash outright. Geography amplifies this financial slaughter. In Mississippi, 49.6% of all sales are pure cash, driven by rock-bottom prices and restricted rural credit access. New Mexico hit 48.8% due to an aggressive in-migration of wealthy households. Montana and Idaho sit at 46 and 45% respectively, entirely corrupted by out-of-state buyers. Hawaii and Maine hover around 44%, hijacked by affluent equity-rich boomers securing second homes. Miami commands 43% cash sales, fueled by international syndicates and luxury hoarding, while San Antonio reaches nearly 40% due to massive investor presence. When you submit a financed offer with an appraisal contingency, the seller laughs and takes the fast, clean cash. The institutional investor narrative is the most misunderstood dynamic of this crisis. Wall Street owns less than 1% of the 82 million single-family homes in America, totaling roughly 450,000 properties. The rental market is actually controlled by mom-and-pop landlords owning fewer than 10 properties, who control 14.4% of the housing stock. Macroeconomic data proves there is zero direct correlation between national institutional ownership and outsized price appreciation. But national averages are a lie designed to keep you complacent. Institutional buyers operate within a highly weaponized, surgically precise buy box. They target newer, post-1980 3- to 4-bedroom starter homes in high-growth Sunbelt markets with top-tier school districts and tight supply. When you zoom in to specific zip codes in Atlanta, Phoenix, and Tampa, institutional ownership of actively listed rental homes brutally exceeds 50%. In these specific trenches, Wall Street directly strips inventory from your hands. For every single property an institutional investor acquires, the number of homes belonging to actual owner-occupiers plummets by 0.22. Politicians are trying to capitalize on your anger. Lawmakers drafted the End Wall Street Hoarding of Homes Act, known as Senate Bill 3402, aiming to tax the absolute life out of institutional investors and ban them from using government-backed financing for bulk single-family purchases. Economists are sounding the alarm that this legislation is a double-edged sword. Institutional landlords actually drive local rents down slightly through operational efficiency and rental supply expansion. You cannot build your way out of this crisis because the supply chain is totally broken. Construction budgets entering 2026 are operating on a permanently devastating baseline. Total material costs have exploded by 34% since December 2020. Federal trade policy is pouring gasoline on this fire. The expansion of Section 232 tariffs on imported metals has annihilated domestic construction predictability. Steel prices are up 13% year over year. Copper products climbed 4.9%. Aluminum prices have violently spiked by roughly 40% in the United States, driven by aggressive duties and choked inventories. When materials cost this much, affordable starter homes become a mathematical impossibility for developers. Profit margins are entirely compressed. Developers are forced to abandon the missing middle and redirect all remaining capital toward high-end luxury estates, the only sector where inflated material costs can be successfully passed on to wealthy buyers. Contractors are panicking, relying on pre-positioning, buying supplies months in advance just to dodge future price explosions. This drains working capital and bankrupts smaller regional builders who cannot float millions in upfront inventory costs. Even if developers secure the materials, there is no one left to hammer the nails. The construction industry is suffocating under a structural deficit of 500,000 workers. 20% of the existing workforce is over the age of 55 and rapidly aging out, while less than 3% of young Americans are willing to step onto a job site. Strict immigration enforcement throughout 2025 terrified workers away from sites, causing 45% of construction firms to report massive project delays. Construction wages are surging by more than 4% annually as desperate firms cannibalize each other for a vanishing talent pool. But the real threat to residential housing is the artificial intelligence sector. Fueled by federal subsidies and insatiable cloud computing demands, data center construction starts are projected to obliterate records, exceeding $58 billion in 2026. This represents a mind-numbing 3-year compounded annual growth rate of 98.7%. These hyper-funded industrial megaprojects act as a black hole, absorbing every available skilled laborer, every piece of heavy machinery, and every raw material in the region. A residential developer trying to build a cul-de-sac cannot compete with a trillion-dollar tech conglomerate building a server farm. The single-family home supply remains structurally depressed, accelerating the desperate pivot toward modular and off-site construction to bypass the labor bloodbath. This supply paralysis is actively fracturing the geography of the United States. The real estate market has shattered into localized extremes driven by migration reversals and the terrifying realization of uninsurable climate risk. During the pandemic, the Sun Belt experienced explosive, irrational price appreciation. Remote workers and institutional algorithms flooded Florida, Texas, and Arizona. By 2026, the music has completely stopped. Austin, Texas, which saw prices hyperinflated by 63% between 2020 and 2022, registered a brutal 6% decline through late 2025. Cape Coral, Florida, after surging 74%, plummeted by 11%. This Sunbelt correction is being accelerated by a catastrophic property carrying cost crisis. The rising frequency of severe convective storms, flooding, and hurricanes has caused insurance premiums to go entirely parabolic. Insurance companies are abandoning entire zip codes, rendering homes effectively unsellable. The cost of living in the Sunbelt now requires massive allowances for insurance and property taxes, destroying the traditional affordability narrative. Inventory in these areas is rotting on the market. Rent growth has flatlined to a 14-year low, and home building permits are in free fall. The middle class is fleeing this uninsurable nightmare and swarming into the refuge markets. Demand is aggressively pivoting back to the harsh winters of the Northeast and the industrial rust of the Midwest. Hartford, Rochester, Worcester, Toledo, and Grand Rapids are absorbing the displaced masses. The median list price in these top 10 refuge markets sits around $384,000, a significant discount from the national median of $415,000. Because the entry price is lower, the mortgage lock-in pressure breaks. A homeowner relocating to Toledo faces a manageable payment gap of only 32.5% to 56.4%, completely bypassing the 73.2% national average. But this massive influx of coastal and Sunbelt refugees is strip mining local inventory. 40% of all listing views in these refuge markets are originating from out-of-state IP addresses. Inventory in Hartford is sitting 60% below pre-pandemic levels. Bidding wars have returned with a vengeance, driving prices up by a staggering 16.3% in these specific metros, while the rest of the nation flatlines. The native middle-class populations of the Midwest are now being violently displaced and gentrified by the exact same forces that ruined California. The fallout from this geographic and economic displacement has triggered a sociological dark age. We have entered the era of suspended adulthood. The inability to afford shelter has created a national housing deficit of 4.03 million units, which directly correlates to exactly 1.82 million missing households. These are Gen Z and millennial adults who should be living independently, but are trapped in childhood bedrooms, basements, or crammed into apartments with 4 roommates. The median age of a first-time homebuyer has violently spiked to a record high of 40 years old. The homeownership rate for Gen Z is hovering at a miserable 27%, a stark contrast to the 70% rates hoarded by baby boomers and Gen X. To survive a market where median housing costs demand a household income of $111,000, younger Americans are executing drastic lifestyle amputations. 39% of struggling adults and 35% of Gen Z have slashed their food budgets. 34% have entirely abandoned vacations. 17% are working brutal side hustles to cover rent. 16% are liquidating their personal possessions for cash. A horrifying 15% are literally skipping meals to survive, and 14% are delaying critical medical care. 15% of Gen Z has officially moved back in with their parents. The nuclear family model is dead. You are witnessing the rise of co-buying, where desperate young adults draft prenuptial-style legal contracts to pool money with platonic roommates just to afford a single piece of equity. This spatial and financial suffocation is causing the national birth rate to collapse. You cannot start a family in a rented bedroom. When these young buyers do scrape together a down payment, they are forced to buy properties in the Midwest that are highly vulnerable to climate events, walking straight into a trap of false affordability, where low mortgage payments are instantly wiped out by massive roof repairs and predatory insurance premiums. The broader consumer economy is being starved of the massive spending waves historically triggered by household formation. By locking an entire generation into permanent structural rentership, the system is guaranteeing severe, irreversible societal wealth inequality. Local governments realize that demand-side subsidies and down payment grants only pump more cash into a starved market, driving prices even higher. The battlefield has shifted to the regulatory code. The Yes in My Backyard movement has launched an aggressive state-level assault against a century of exclusionary Euclidean zoning laws. They are attempting to legalize the missing middle by force. States are overriding local municipalities to legalize accessory dwelling units by right. Georgia's House Bill 1166 exempts dwellings under 400 square feet from local zoning mafia decisions. Florida's Senate Bill 48 forces local governments to allow ADUs by right. Michigan passed House Bill 5584, and Idaho deployed Senate Bill 1277 to physically outlaw restrictive covenants that ban secondary units. Cities like Houston and Cincinnati have rewritten their land use laws to permit duplexes and triplexes in formerly exclusive single-family zones. Pennsylvania advanced House Bill 2185, while Michigan passed House Bill 5584 to explicitly legalize duplexes. The invisible taxes of minimum lot sizes and parking mandates are being gutted. Colorado's House Bill 1114 and Michigan's House Bill 5530 establish aggressive caps on residential lot requirements. Virginia's House Bill 1212 forces localities with populations over 20,000 to permit single-family homes on lots as small as 3,000 square feet.
Florida's Senate Bill 1342 forces the creation of high-density zones within a half-mile of public transit, explicitly banning height limits of less than 8 stories and eliminating parking minimums by right. Illinois passed the Transit Opportunity Zone Act, Senate Bill 3212, automatically approving multifamily housing near transit if local bureaucrats stall the permits for more than 90 days. Maryland's Senate Bill 389 and Senate Bill 829, along with Virginia's House Bill 816, bypass conditional use permits entirely for mixed-use developments. Boston successfully converted 1.2 million square feet of dead office space into 1,500 new residential units. Massachusetts just brute forced a $5.16 trillion Affordable Homes Act. But these zoning wars are incredibly slow. Upzoning accidentally triggers massive speculative land rushes where developers hoard upzoned dirt, waiting for appreciation instead of building, unless checked by a brutal land value tax. Zoning reform will save the housing market of 2036, but it does absolutely nothing for the financial slaughter you are facing right now. You need to know exactly how to legally structure a multi-party co-buying agreement to secure equity with platonic partners before the threshold moves entirely out of reach. Look closely at this breakdown of the exact prenup-style contract clauses that will protect you from a roommate defaulting on a shared mortgage.